The Tom Woods Show, episode 2348.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey, everybody. As the academic year winds down, it's time to start thinking about what you're going to do in the fall. And of course, I highly recommend the self-taught K through 12 Ron Paul curriculum. Not only will your kids get the real story about everything, but they'll also learn the kinds of practical things that they won't learn in the traditional school. For instance, how to be an effective public speaker, how to manage money, and how to run your own home business. And of course, when they reach the high school grades, they will be learning Western civilization and U.S. government from old Tom Woods here. But here's the most important thing. If you're going to join, make sure you join through my link, because only through my link do you get $160 worth of free bonuses. My link is ronpaulhomeschool.com. Hey, everybody. Tom Woods here. So glad to have our old friend, Brad Birzer, on the program. And at the last minute, not that anybody needs to know this, but I switched computers that I'm recording on. And that other computer, Brad, I had your full title, because I think you're the Russell Kirk chair. Now I don't have any of that anymore. So introduce yourself to the folks, Brad.
Hi, Tom. It's great to be talking to you. I am at Hillsdale. Yes, I'm the Russell Amos Kirk chair in American Studies and professor of history.
Okay.
So how's that for fancy titles?
I just wanted to make sure I had the title right. And of course,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I've got one of your books in front of me right here that I want to talk about. And this deals mostly with, or let's say exclusively, I would say, with modern writers and cultural figures. So we're talking about really, I mean, how far back do we really go here? Maybe a little over 100 years in terms of when these people would have been born?
Yeah, just right about 100 years, but most of it's recent, last decade or so.
Right. And we're talking about everything from novelists to movies to television and so on. So there's plenty to talk about here. And we're going to be covering material that a lot of people know and like, but we'll be getting your particular take on it. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that Stephen Wilson is in here. So obviously, we have to say something about that. But let's start with...
Absolutely.
The book we're talking about here is Mythic Realms, The Moral Imagination in Literature and Film. Let me tell you something about Brad Birzer, first of all, in case you don't know. Brad and I have a very interesting history. So I'm sorry to keep bringing this story up. I swear to you, Brad, I swear I harbor no resentment whatsoever. I promise. But I just can't help mentioning that I applied for the same job that you now hold. And you got the job that I
didn't know where you were going with that.
So you have the job that I wanted to have back at that time. But it's perfectly fine. I am so content with how my life turned out. It's perfectly fine. But anyway, we became friends just in the course of podcast interviews and email correspondence and reading each other's material over the years, such that you were a groomsman at my wedding, even though we had never actually met in person. Now, we had been in the same room.
That was wonderful.
You remember that? Yeah, it just because you were such a good person. I said, I'm going to do something nobody's ever done. I'm going to have you. But the thing is, we had tried to meet, you and I, several times, and it would constantly fall through. Like either a health issue or a conflict or whatever. We've tried to meet 3 or 4 times or do things together, and it just fell through. So I thought, well, this is how I'll know if my marriage is meant to be, because if Brad can actually show up and we're in the same room together, then it's a definite. Anyway, so that's a little something about Brad's background and in terms of our relationship together. But I notice in this subtitle, The Moral Imagination in Literature and Film, a very Kirkian expression. He loved to talk about things like the moral imagination. But can you explain for dummies like me what that term is meant to convey?
Well, it's great to be talking, Tom. Thanks for having me on. This is really nice. And yes, I loved your wedding. That was a wonderful, absolutely wonderful weekend. So the moral imagination, yeah, you're right. That does have a very Kirkian feel to it. The idea of the moral imagination actually goes back to Edmund Burke and his writings on the French Revolution. And basically, he was arguing that in the French Revolution, there was a very kind of sterile way of understanding the human person as merely being a random individual within the collective. And Burke argued that when we look at one another, we really have to see one another through the eyes that essentially God would see us through. That is, each of us being born in a certain time in a certain place, unique to that circumstance, clothed in specific garments. And that's how we see one another. So when I look at you, Tom, I don't just see another human being, but I actually see beyond the human being and into the soul. That's what the moral imagination is supposed to do. So C.S. Lewis talked about this as the kind of weight of glory, that we look at how someone is meant to be seen through godly eyes. So my point in using the moral imagination, and there are others who use that term as well. T.S. Eliot was fond of using the term moral imagination. Irving Babbitt, one of the great figures of the early 20th century that hardly anyone remembers anymore, also talked quite a bit about the moral imagination. So it was definitely a part of kind of Harvard culture at the turn of the last century. So this idea of moral imagination is really an attempt to look at certain things. So in this book, Mythic Realms, I look at someone like Alfred Hitchcock and try and figure out how he viewed the human person, or Willa Cather, or even I take it down into a deep dive into popular culture, even someone like Alan Moore, Frank Miller, who are comic book writers. I was very interested in how they try to perceive the human person as well. So it's really, the moral imagination is just kind of a fancy way of saying a deep look at an individual.
You start off by talking about some writers who kind of helped to shape you as you were coming of age, let's say, and as you moved into adulthood and beyond, the writers who never really left you. Now, sometimes with a libertarian audience, it's quite understandable. A libertarian audience will want to know, well, what are libertarian authors I should read? But these days, I'm kind of more interested in who are some authors I should read who will help to expand my mind kind of beyond where I already am, and moreover, help to give me insights that will improve me not simply as a pure libertarian, but as a human being. And I don't know that necessarily the set of authors that accomplished that and the set of authors who influenced you entirely overlap, but maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I was introduced very early on, and I'm sure you were as well, Tom, but I was very young when my mom started handing me books, learning how to read. So I became kind of obsessed with books as a little kid. And the two authors that I didn't really come to until the end of my grade school years, but they've stuck with me, the two authors who meant the most to me were Ray Bradbury and J.R.R. Tolkien. And I love their worlds. I love their writing. I love the way that they approach things. So those were, for me at least, originally the two great figures. But there were others as well. I loved Ursula Le Guin. I liked a number of different authors, especially in science fiction and fantasy. There were a number of people that really did shape me at the time. But I would say most of all, at least as I like to think of it now as a 55-year-old looking back, I think that it was probably Bradbury and Tolkien more than anyone else.
I want to say a little something about Bradbury because of the oddball way I came across him. I was in sixth grade, and we had to read, let's say, X number of books from an approved list over the course of the year. And then I don't know if we took a test on them. It's all very vague in my mind, but we had this list. And of course, I was pretty good as a student in elementary school, and I was really good in high school. But middle school, I just had no motivation. So I was okay, but I had no motive. I was lazy. So of course, like all the other kids, we're looking at the list. We're very assiduously checking out at the library which were the shortest of these books. Of course, that's our first instinct. How can I do the least work possible? But because of that, everybody had already taken out all the shortest books. So, Woods was a little slow to get to the library that day. So I looked on the list, and almost at random, I picked out The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, which is a collection of his short stories. I mean, he really is a short story writer, even though Fahrenheit 451 is a novel, but he's really a short story writer. That's really where he shines, and that's what he's best known for. So I took that out, and I was a kid who I had no interest in this. I did not want to be reading this book. I'm doing it because there's a gun to my head, figuratively speaking, so I'll do it, but I don't want to be doing it. And I'll tell you something, that book knocked my socks off to the point where I went in, and I'll tell you, you do not become the most popular kid in class when you go in and you say, hey, this book on the reading list is really great. You guys should read it. That is what I tried to do. I learned a lesson that day, Brad, but that is what I did. I was absolutely spellbound. So I have a book of, I don't know if it's really all his stories, but it's a giant, giant collection. And I'm very happy that my daughter, who's now just about to turn 20, years ago found it on my shelf and read every single story in it. So that's a little bit ambitious, but I will say to people, if you want to just get out of your normal zone of what you might read, get The Illustrated Man and go through those stories, and you'll see what I mean. You'll see what I mean. It's really spellbinding. And not to mention, to some degree, he has a worldview that's not a million miles away from ours, in the sense that, at the very least, he was concerned about the same kind of cultural forces that we're concerned about, and about censorship and suppression of ideas and stuff like that.
Yeah, I agree, Tom. And The Illustrated Man is fantastic. That was actually his second book. His first book was called Dark Carnival, which is almost impossible to get anymore. It was published by a small publishing house out of Wisconsin. And The Illustrated Man was his first with a major publisher. And so that really is, in many ways, kind of the great classic book. And right after that, he wrote Martian Chronicles, and then a little bit later, Golden Apples of the Sun and Fahrenheit 451. But there's a moment there between when Bradbury is about 26 up until he's about age 33, where he is just writing nonstop. And what a creative mind. Just, I think, an amazing figure.
So Bradbury is definitely one who belongs on the list. Now, I jotted some things down here about your book. You point out that initially, what we now know today as science fiction did not enjoy a particularly good reputation, but that over time, it gradually did. So what was the story there?
Yeah, a lot of this is tied up into American ethnic groups, strangely enough, Tom. And when you go back and look at science fiction, especially in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, it took quite a while for it to become mainstream. And of course, now it is mainstream. But I would argue pretty forcibly that it was really Ray Bradbury and C.S. Lewis more than any other figures that made it respectable. And I mentioned it's tied to America's ethnicities and ethnic history. At the time when science fiction was coming out, especially in the 1920s and the 1930s, very few mainstream publications would publish anything that even remotely sounded like science fiction. And so you have all these mainstream publishers, Collier's, other major magazines, and they were really only publishing kind of white Protestant Anglo-Saxon authors. And science fiction arose very early in the 20th century from both Jews and Catholics because they were excluded from mainstream publishing. And so there were a lot of Jewish publishers in New York City, and there were a lot of Catholic authors. And the same thing was true in Hollywood, of course, where you have a kind of confluence as well of Jews and Catholics. So they were really outside of the mainstream, but then became somewhat mainstream by the 1960s into the 1970s. So I think it's one of those great kind of immigrant stories about America where there is discrimination, but these people work around that discrimination and create a brand new genre and do some really amazing things with it.
I wonder, again, I don't want to pick up a book or go to the movies and constantly be thinking, does this book teach the principles that I believe in? Sometimes I want to leave that aside and just immerse myself in another world and enjoy it. But at the same time, I'm sure you'll agree that science fiction is a genre that it's very easy for people with, let's say, ideologies that are out of favor to spread their ideas there, because in science fiction, you're in effect talking about a completely different world. So you can build that world according to whatever principles you want. And so therefore it becomes a kind of a playground for the author, if he is ideologically inclined, to kind of insert his ideas into this new world that he can't implement in the existing world. And so I'm sure we can think of examples of that. So is there a tendency in science fiction so that, let's say, more than half of it might be inclined to be at least implicitly drawing ideological conclusions? Or am I exaggerating that?
Not at all, Tom. And I actually think that science fiction as a genre is in many ways kind of an anti-genre. That is, it doesn't fit cleanly into the other kinds of things that we think of with Westerns or romances or other genres, because there's always this creative element in science fiction. There's limitless possibilities with what you can do in science fiction. Now, of course, we can pretty much do that on film, But that would not have been possible in the first half of the 20th century, where really your mind is the only theater. And I would argue that even left-wing writers within science fiction were still at some level anti-authoritarian because they were writing in the genre of science fiction, which was so counter-mainstream. And you can find within science fiction everything from serious Marxists and Greens all the way to hardcore libertarians like Robert Heinlein. Bradbury is an interesting figure because he is always anti-totalitarian, but he actually becomes explicitly, and one of your newsletters dealt with this brilliantly, Tom, he becomes explicitly more libertarian as he got older and really rejected kind of the left more than kind of. He did very definitely reject the left, and especially political correctness and other things. And I think you can feel that even in Fahrenheit 451, when he was still a very devoted member of the Democratic Party and an Adlai Stevenson fan, you can still feel that deep anti-authoritarianism within Bradbury.
I want to say a little something, if we might, because I know we could talk about Willa Cather, whom I know you love.
I do love Cather.
Yes, that's right. Personally, the subject matter of her novels interests me so little. It was hard for me to really become too fond of her. But at the same time, I kind of like Sinclair Lewis. Maybe you don't share that feeling?
I don't dislike him at all. He's just not someone that I've ever really delved into very deeply. So, I'm familiar with Babbitt and his other major works. And what was the 1935 kind of anti-authoritarian novel he had?
Was it It Can't Happen Here? Something like that?
It Can't Happen Here, right? I've never read that, Tom.
Yeah, no, I haven't either. And I don't know that it's one, because Main Street is one of his great ones. Aerosmith is one of his great ones. But he has so many. I mean, he's like Haydn's symphonies, who's got like 100 of them. How good can they be? I mean, I'm sorry for any Haydn fans there. There are some good ones in there. But his output is notoriously variable in quality. So I don't remember if that's considered to be one of the greats, but it probably, or it could well have something to say to us these days. But it's interesting that you spent some time in here on Alfred Hitchcock. Now, I've seen some Alfred Hitchcock films, and the thing is, I want to talk about them without spoiling them for people. But yet, how do you talk about Rope, that movie, without spoiling it?
Yeah, that's a hard one. And
that's a hard one.
It is a hard one. And I can't remember if I spoiled that or not.
You spoil this thing like completely in this chapter. But
that's too bad.
Let me try to venture into this and just say that if you see Rope, it's going to be different from any cinematic experience you've had. That's just a fact. What makes it unique is, discuss that. Cinematically speaking, what is the unique feature of the movie Rope?
Well, there are very few takes in the movie, and it's done much more like a play. So you've got this kind of idyllic opening scene with a murder. It's idyllic in the sense that it's showing a normal city street, and then suddenly we hear a scream within an apartment, and that all happens within the first couple minutes of the film. And then the rest of the film is a kind of feast by these two murderers in which they're having this party and a dinner party, and they're trying to basically pull the wool over everyone's eyes who knew the murder victim. So there are very few takes in the movie. In fact, what they would do is they would just shoot an entire film canister, and then they would just go to the next film canister and the next one and the next one.
Right. So it's all happening
repeatedly. It feels seamless, the movie does.
It feels like it's just one uninterrupted cut, and then likewise that it's all taking place in this one room. Yeah. Now there have been other movies that are like that part, I suppose. But what's interesting about, again, I don't want to reveal what is the full plot of the movie, but let's just say that what makes it interesting is the crispness of the dialogue and how very, very gradually over the course of that evening, a extremely shocking realization comes to light. Anyway, there's nothing like it. I think there's just nothing like it.
I love it, Tom.
Yeah.
I've seen it so many times. I like it more every time I see it.
I want to say something about, though, when I say nobody, I mean almost nobody has heard of. There is a Catholic author that you also spend some time on, who won't be as well known, obviously, as Ray Bradbury or C.S. Lewis or some of the others you have in the book, but that's Michael O'Brien. And I read some of his books a long time ago, like probably in my early 20s, I think. I think there's one mistake in your book.
Oh,
And that is, yes, in listing out the books in his series, you give his 1998 book as Children of the Sun, but it's actually called Eclipse of the Sun.
Oh, you're right. I think maybe that was the name of the series. But I
Yeah,
think
or something like that, because Eclipse of the Sun is my favorite book of his.
Oh, yeah, that is a really good book.
It is a really good book, and Father Elijah is a very good book. And these are books in which people are having, well, Father Elijah in particular, extremely deep and very, very meaningful philosophical conversations. But also, particularly in Eclipse of the Sun, you look at what the end times, so to speak, might actually look like.
Right.
And it's not that in the end times there will be literally a figure with horns on his head. What's more interesting about it is that that is not the packaging that really bad people very often come in. Like, for example, very, very, very rarely do tyrants say, I'm going to be a tyrant over you because I'm an evil person who loves to exercise power. Instead, it's, I'm going to exercise this power because it's for your own good.
Yeah.
And you have to be a little clever to see through what's really going on.
Yeah. My favorite, Tom, and I don't know if you ever had a chance to read this one, but my favorite of that series was Sophia House.
I did not read that. So when I saw that that was your favorite, I thought, all right, well, maybe I do have to read this one if Brad says it's the best one. Brad says it's his favorite. That's a distinction.
It's an amazing dive into Nazi Poland in the 1940s and just incredible discussion with Father Elijah when he's a boy and this Pole who's taking care of him and making him safe from the Nazis. Really incredible story. Some excellent philosophical dialogue in there.
And again, I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping around and I'm picking things that are a little bit
sure.
odd, that maybe I should be focusing. But the thing is, I think everybody kind of understands at this point Tolkien and his significance. There are major motion pictures made out of his books and things like that. But there are some lesser known folks in here that I like making reference to. But having said that, there was a very popular movie some years ago that you spent some time on, and that's V for Vendetta. And I like V for Vendetta because there's, of course, that great line about the importance of how we have to show them why they need us, so why they need the political class. But what I found interesting about that movie, though, is that the way they portray the totalitarian dystopia of the future is that it's some right-wing, pro-Christianity regime whose main figures are all hypocrites behind closed doors. But it's this right-wing regime that makes homosexuality illegal and stuff like that. And I just found that so tone deaf that the writers would think that that's the plausible scenario. There's like no chance of that. That is not what the dystopia of the future is going to look like at all. But even with that weird emphasis in the movie, there's still much that's worthwhile in it.
Yeah, I agree, Tom. And I think that criticism is definitely well taken. And I was more influenced by the graphic novel, which I think is a brilliant graphic novel, than I was by the movie. I liked the movie, but the movie didn't have quite the power that the graphic novel does. And I think in part, the graphic novel, and it comes from Alan Moore, and Alan Moore is just a really, really strange human being in all kinds of ways. And I think his concerns are mostly with the right rather than with the left. And so he looks at that totalitarianism as coming from the right. But I do think that neo-fascism comes from the left's rejection of Thatcher in the 1980s. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we can criticize that pretty strongly. But that's kind of the historical precedent of that.
Okay, that's it. But even that is a misreading of Thatcher.
Of course.
Even if nevertheless, the idea of the book is not necessarily that this is Thatcher's regime, but that after years of turmoil, this is the regime that emerges out of the ashes there.
Absolutely, Tom.
If you were going to, now this is an impossible thing I'm asking of you. Like whenever people say to me, I'm not going to ask you what's your favorite book, what's your favorite movie. I can't give an answer to those questions. And it frustrates me that I can't, but I really can't. But that's only because of the happy fact that there are just so darn many good ones. It was very hard for me to choose. But let's say, instead of saying, what are your favorite books or whatever, what would be 3 books you think people would not only find enjoyable in the sense they keep them entertained, but they would in some way feel fulfilled for having read over the past 100 years?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would say, and I know you're not a huge fan of her, but I would say Willa Cather is really,
Really? Okay.
especially her book, My Antonia. Such a beautiful look at various ethnic groups in Nebraska and how they get along. And I think it's just a gorgeous novel, and I think it's very fulfilling at the end of it. I would also, in more of a popular vein, Cather's a little bit highbrow at times, but I think in a more popular vein, I do think that something like The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury,
Great book.
it's
Yep.
a very fulfilling book. Certainly, almost any of the science fiction novels that C.S. Lewis wrote, my favorite of his is That Hideous Strength. I've read that many times. I've taught it many times. I think that it is one of the most successful critiques of progressivism that I've ever encountered. And I think one of the things that Lewis does so well is he doesn't just dismiss progressivism. He looks at all of its permutations, and That Hideous Strength, I think, is his great reaction to that. So that's 3 right there. But certainly The Lord of the Rings as one. But you're right, Tom, that's probably one that most of your listeners have read. I would be surprised if they've all read That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. Most people have read Narnia, but not that many people have read his science fiction. And I think that's very worth looking into. So those are the kinds of books that I would encourage. But other science fiction that I love, Walter Miller's Canticle for Leibowitz is one of the greats, to be sure. And I think Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein is really good, but it's more of an adventure story, but it still has a lot of depth to it. So there are a lot of different things that I think people could really dive into in the last 100 years, especially in terms of science fiction, but others as well.
By the way, I'm going to put your recommendations on the show notes page. That'll be
Oh, great. Thanks,
tomwoods.com/2348.
Tom.
So that way people don't have to write them down or whatever. But if they're curious, they can find them there. And in particular, I think it's worth noting that Ralph Raico, who was a great libertarian historian, died some years ago. He was not a religious believer, but he loved and highly recommended the book That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so
Wow.
you don't have to feel like, well, that book is not for me. It's just for one sector of the population. No, that's not so. That's definitely not so. Let's take a quick minute to thank our sponsor, Monetary Metals. Jeff Deist is no longer president of the Mises Institute. I am as sad as you are about that, but I'd like to tell you where Jeff is now. The great and brilliant Jeff Deist is with a company called Monetary Metals, a company I have been using for, I don't know, a year or two probably. And the idea of it is this. We all know the direction the dollar is going in. Many of us own some gold, but we own that gold by, I don't know, putting it in a box somewhere or hiding it or whatever, but it just sits there. But what if that gold could actually generate interest instead of just sitting there? Well, you can grow your gold year after year with Monetary Metals, which offers interest on gold paid in more ounces of physical gold. You can earn 2 to 4% on gold and silver in their leasing program, which supports qualified gold-using businesses. And if you're an accredited investor, you can earn higher returns, think double digits, in their gold bond offerings. All the interest is paid in physical ounces of gold, so your total ounces grow and compound year over year. So at 2.5% annual, 100 ounces becomes 128. At 3%, 100 ounces becomes 134 ounces. At 4%, 100 ounces becomes 148 ounces. You get the idea. They've been at this for 7 years now. Jeff Deist recently joined forces with them, as I said. Their vice president of relationships, Addison Quayle, has been a guest on my show. He's been a guest in my home. I've seen him for years and years at all kinds of libertarian conferences. These are all our people doing something really, really creative and important. So start saving and earning in gold. Go to monetary-metals.com/woods to learn more about how to get started with your account. That's monetary-metals.com/woods. We are now going to move ahead to the ultimate Woods indulgence here, which is Stephen Wilson.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Now, I love Stephen Wilson, and I just saw on his Facebook page, Stephen Wilson's a musician, for all of you who don't know. He was in a band called Porcupine Tree, and they're great. And they just got together after 12 years to make a new album. They're great. I love them. I saw them in 2 different cities, New York and Boston. And he just posted on his Facebook page that he's going to have a listening event for his forthcoming album on July 12th in London. And if you'd like to come, you should write to them. I'm going to be in London until July 9th, Brad. That is just
no.
one of the, that's like missing Marillion Weekend with you twice in a row. You know,
That's right.
This is like a dagger right in my eyeballs, basically. But
Tom,
anyway,
I'm sorry.
He's a very creative musician, and maybe he doesn't always succeed, but he's always trying something new. He says, one thing I don't like is repeating myself musically. Now, I don't want to mention any names or of any bands because then I'll get angry mail from their fans. But we all know, if we're being honest, there are some bands that if you have one album, you have them all. And that's not true with Steven Wilson. So anyway, you have a chapter in here about his album, I think it's from 2015, called Hand Cannot Erase. And that album is devastating to me. For me, I know everybody likes Ancestral and particular tracks on it. The first and the last are my favorites. The first and the last. Routine is too over-the-top devastating for my heart to manage. But first and the last are the best for me. But anyway, I don't want to take away the fun of laying out, and I shouldn't say fun because it's quite tragic, the premise of this particular recording. Can you do that?
Well, the story is, and by the way, Tom, I love Routine. And as someone who has, Deidre and I lost a child, Routine is the most beautifully written song about loss that I've encountered. I love the whole album, but that song Routine just gets to me every time. And especially the live version on, is it Permeating? The Home Invasion live
Yes, the
CD.
Home Invasion live. I haven't heard the live thing, but it's that, I can't remember her name, but the woman he sings it with, the woman, woman's voice, the Israeli woman.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I can't bear it. And I haven't suffered such a loss, but I can't bear it. It's so emotionally overwhelming.
It is emotionally overwhelming. There's no question about that. The story that Steven Wilson tells is that he loves documentaries. He's obsessed with documentaries. And he was watching a documentary about a woman who died in her apartment. She was popular. She was popular at work. She was popular on the social scene, but she died in her apartment and nobody knew it for a couple of years. She wasn't paying her electric bill and the electric company didn't check on her. Nobody checked on her.
Well, also, it was an arrangement where somehow the rent had been paid in advance for quite a number of months. So there was no landlord checking up on her either.
Yeah, it's just a crazy story. And I think that Wilson was really taken with the idea that we could be so alienated in the modern world that a person could literally be missing for years without anyone actually noticing or checking up on that person. So then what Wilson did is he took this and kind of fictionalized it. So he didn't follow the story exactly, but he created this whole fictional person. But it's a similar kind of story with Hand Cannot Erase. And I think the emotional depth that Wilson reaches on that album is just extraordinary. And I know there are great bands. Big Train is amazing. Old Yes is amazing. But nothing quite reaches the depth of loss that I think Hand Cannot Erase does. And even that track, Hand Cannot Erase, right, was just, the lyrics are incredible for that. So I agree with you, Tom. There are a few things that Wilson has done that maybe don't succeed as well as others, but the guy is just ceaselessly creative. He never stops trying. He's always pursuing excellence. So when I put Mythic Realms together, I actually was going to make part of it about rock. So I was going to do something on literature and film and then on rock. And it just got too bloated. It started losing its coherence when I started doing that. But because Steven Wilson's idea of Hand Cannot Erase came from a film, I thought, well, I could at least put that chapter in my section on film because of that connection. I'm very glad I did because I love the album and I'm glad to be able to promote it wherever I can.
Well, when we think about it, there is a paradox here that you could be. She lived in a big city. Maybe she lived in London. I don't remember exactly if she lived in London.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So she lives in a big city. And yet in the big city, you can be swallowed up and become completely anonymous and invisible. And he's saying that by contrast, if you live in a small town, There's no way this is going to happen.
Right.
There's no way. The milkman will figure out that something's wrong and
That's
something
right.
will happen. So there was an interesting thing about the anonymity of big cities and this particular arrangement of society. But I'm pretty sure that the story has it that when she was found, there were indeed wrapped presents around her. And so what Wilson, with some poetic license, does is he suggests that these are for her nieces and nephews, and that she was planning to sort of reconnect by saying, look, you may not have heard from me for a while. You probably thought I was dead, but the time has just gone by. Just I could barely even keep control of it. And I hope the kids still remember me. And then the most devastating line is, I'm feeling kind of drowsy now, so I'll finish this tomorrow.
Right.
And you, the listener, know there is no tomorrow.
That's right. Yeah.
Come on.
Did you ever watch the documentary?
I did, because I became fascinated with this woman. Yes.
Right.
Joyce Carol Vincent.
Yeah. And I thought the documentary was very good. There were certain things where they were just asking random people on the street what they thought. And I thought that didn't work very well. But I did think that the documentary overall was really good. But I think Wilson's album is even better. I think it makes the story even greater than it was. But it is a terribly tragic story.
I want to share an insight from my wife, who said, there are a lot of metal bands who try to be edgy and try to shock you with, like, let's say, well, obviously, blasphemous content, but extreme gore, extremely gory lyrics and song titles, and the kinds of things they sing about are just unbelievable, how graphic they are. And she says, but you know what's interesting? That is not nearly as edgy as Steven Wilson, because that is kind of like, okay, been there, done that. You're singing about disemboweling somebody. All right, well, you already done that. So, like, what else you got? I mean, this is a big deal. It's predictable. It's safe in a way because everyone expects it. But the kinds of compositions coming from a guy like Steven Wilson, because they're real, most people are not disemboweling other people.
Right.
This is real tragedy, real people, real life. Like, one quick thing, I don't mean to make this whole thing about Steven Wilson, but that song Heart Attack in a Lay-By by Porcupine Tree.
Absolutely.
So this guy's going to pull over at the side of the road because he's feeling a little bit uncomfortable, and he's thinking about getting home and being with his loved one and growing old together. But the song is called Heart Attack in a Lay-By. So that means he's not going to grow old with her. And it just, come on.
Yeah.
And I remember at one of his shows, he said, look, I know that I write a lot of depressing things, but he said, even I think, and he started to list a few of them, even I think these are a little bit too much. But the thing is, Brad, what do you think about this? I think that there is something to be said for what he says about deeply sad songs, that he says songs that are supposed to make me happy make me miserable. But a sad song is a song I can connect to because it reminds me that I'm not alone in my suffering, that other people have suffered through similar things too.
Yeah. Stephen's not Christian at all. But one of the things that I tried to do in that piece was try and show that he's still, even though he's not in any way an adherent to any faith, there's a kind of incarnational understanding of the human person in Hand Cannot Erase. I think it really does get to the depth of a very Catholic understanding of how unique we each are. And I think that's part of what you're saying, Tom, at least as I'm hearing you, this idea of suffering. I mean, we all do that. We all suffer. We all go through these things. And I think it really touches our deep humanity. And that's what's so great about Wilson's music and his lyrics.
I'm going to open not a can of worms, but a topic that could easily be an entire episode. So you just pace yourself however you like with this.
Okay.
But you do take some time talking about film adaptations that involve well-known superhero figures, in particular Batman and Superman. And I know that there are films about each character that you like and films that you dislike. What makes a good superhero film, and what insights from the moral imagination can we glean from them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tom, and not an easy one to answer. I very much like Zack Snyder as a director. I love Christopher Nolan, and I just think everything Nolan does is fascinating, whether it's something as bizarre as Tenet or something superhero-wise like The Dark Knight Returns or The Dark Knight Rises. I just think that he's doing really interesting things, both Snyder and Nolan. And the reason I like superhero movies so much, I like superheroes as a genre, but I like the superhero movies, at least the DC movies. I like them because they take the idea of virtue seriously. They don't mock it, they don't twist it. And I think so many modern movies are so cynical about so many things. And a good superhero movie actually resonates with, I think, our Greco-Roman tradition. I think we can think of Odysseus, we can think of Aeneas, or we can jump into Dante. I think that there are very serious things that are going on in both a Zack Snyder as well as a Christopher Nolan movie. I can't speak quite as well about the Marvel movies. I never got into the Avengers. For whatever reason, they never spoke to me in the same way that the DC movies did. But I especially love the Dark Knight trilogy because I think the character of Bruce Wayne and of Batman and his trajectory in the first movie where he's combating fear, in the second movie where he's combating chaos, and the third movie, which is essentially a rewrite of the French Revolution, he's combating disorder in the public square. I think those are amazing films. And especially in that third movie, The Dark Knight Rises, where you really do have this retelling of the French Revolution. And yet the good guys are the anti-revolutionaries in that. I think you couldn't do that in a mainstream film, but you can do that in Batman, and it comes across as genius. And it is genius, I think.
What do you think about a point that the late Paul Cantor used to make when he would talk to people who were very, very pessimistic about the state of culture around the world, which I am, by the way, but they took that pessimism and extrapolated it into claims about how our culture doesn't produce anything that's any good in terms of literature, movies, art over the past however many years. And his point was, if I go back to ancient Greece and look at the great dramas, yeah, they're all fantastic, but that's why they survived. The ones that were no good, we don't have. So we have the conclusion that, wow, everything they did was brilliant. He said, so yeah, a lot of what we produce now, no one's going to care about in 100 years. But if you think about like the 10 greatest films or the 10 greatest novels or whatever, I would put them up against any age, any time. And yeah, and other ages had terrible things, but those terrible things didn't survive. And so we have this skewed sense of ours being a particularly unimpressive period, when in fact, despite all the decadence around us, there have been genuine masterpieces produced. Well, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I only got to meet Paul twice, and I really liked him both times, and he was a real inspiration to me. And I saw him speak on Shakespeare. I never saw him speak on popular culture, but I've read his stuff on popular culture, and I've read his stuff on Westerns in particular, and I'm very taken with it. And I think that Paul was a great, truly fantastic scholar. I don't think he ever would have gotten away with what he had gotten away with if he had not been a Shakespearean scholar first. I think that he really made his reputation as a great Shakespearean scholar, and then he was able to take that to the X-Files or to John Ford or whatever it might be that he was writing on. So there's a great background in what he's doing. But I would put it maybe this way, Tom, and I'm coming specifically from a Catholic perspective on this, but if you look at the ancient world, they loved their heroes and their gods and their demigods. I mean, I say loved in the sense that they embraced them. They didn't always respect them, but they embraced them. In the medieval world, we have this absolute love of the saints. And I think it's written into our very natures that we like things greater than ourselves, that we aspire to things that are greater than ourselves. And for whatever reason, since about 1939 or so, our great heroes in Western culture have been either in Westerns or they've been in superhero movies. They've been people like Superman or Batman. And our kids are growing up on that in so many ways. And I think this is just a healthy thing for us that we look at that and understand that. But I don't disagree at all, Tom. I think that Paul was absolutely right that we don't remember the crud of the ancient world or of the medieval world. It never would have been passed down. most of what we see in popular culture today, I would say, is trash. I would say that probably 999 things out of 1,000 are trash. But when there are excellences like Rope or like the Dark Knight trilogy, when there are excellences like that, they really do stand out. And what a relief to have those excellences compared to all that crud. I just think there are beautiful things. In the same way, most young adult fiction is just terrible. But then you get something like The Lord of the Rings, and it's genius. So there are great things out there, but they're hard to find.
Well, you are an excellent guide to what is great in this book, Mythic Realms, The Moral Imagination in Literature and Film. It is an unapologetically idiosyncratic book, because to go from Willa Cather to Stephen Wilson with Alfred Hitchcock in between, that's quite a journey. And as you told me over email, that the book is kind of autobiographical. It's almost an intellectual history of Brad Birzer in a way, and that's not a bad thing. So, of course, I'll link to it, the book Mythic Realms, at tomwoods.com/2348. But I would feel wrong as I'm looking at the graphical representation of who spoke when. I talked way too much in this conversation, so I want to give you a chance to say a final word if you have one.
Oh, well, thanks, Tom, for having me. I don't think you spoke too much at all. I thought it was an excellent conversation. Part of this book was me thanking my mom. My mom, no matter what our family went through when I was a kid, my mom was always very steady, especially in intellectual things, and always was ready to have a discussion and good conversation, and was always ready with a book. I never went without books, ever. Yeah, no matter what the family situation was. They were always a means by which I could escape some of the stuff in the family. They were a means by which I could survive childhood. And I'm so appreciative both of my mom and of great literature. And then later, I didn't really come to movies until later. Movies and television are more my adult life than my childhood. Books were my childhood, but I didn't really come to movies until about the 1990s. And I think that's one reason that so much of, I mean, Tom, we had music always in the house. So I had two older brothers. So I was exposed to progressive rock music as early as probably 1972 or so when I was 4. So it's just, I've always had books and music, but really movies and TV are relatively recent for me. But yeah, I've had a great time with them. This book was meant to be an homage to my mom, and to thank her for that, even though I dedicated it to Deidre, because Deidre's put up with so many conversations. Deidre, my wife, put up with so many conversations about this stuff. And there are other things in there, like I had the chapter on Beauty and the Beast, stuff that I got to share with my kids. So I think some wonderful things. So yeah, it was a lot of me saying thank you in the book.
Well, it may seem a little cheesy, but I will say that I want to thank you for sharing all this stuff with me and with us and with the world. It's very easy when you're in the kind of niche that I'm in to just be reading white papers about the economy and to be focused on the minutia of day-to-day life and not to engage with something that kind of breaks you beyond those boundaries and takes you to another, perhaps better place. And as I say, you are a wonderful guide for us in doing that in this book, Mythic Realms, which I highly recommend. I recommend anything you do, Brad, but I was particularly happy with this collection. And then when I saw Stephen Wilson, I thought, that is just the icing on the cake. So thanks again, Brad. I appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Tom. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I consider you one of my closest friends and one of the persons I admire most. So thank you.
Thank you, Brad. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.